Maxwell Daniels stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, overlooking the glittering skyline of Chicago. The city stretched out before him, a sprawling network of lights and ambition. As the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire, he had everything a man could dream of: wealth, power, and influence. Yet none of it had ever satisfied him. He was used to people worshiping him, bending to his will, offering him anything he wanted, but it always felt empty. Tonight, however, something different was in the air. The grand party around him was filled with Chicago's elite, people vying for his attention, eager to impress. Music pulsed through the room, and laughter floated above the chatter. But Maxwell wasn't interested. His attention was fixed on one person: Christopher Lawson, his longtime friend and business associate, who stood near the bar, a devilish grin on his face. "Maxwell," Christopher called out, walking toward him, "I have an offer for you." Maxwell raised an eyebrow. "Another deal? Haven't I given you enough already?" Christopher chuckled, shaking his head. "Not business, my friend. This is something much more interesting." Maxwell was intrigued despite himself. "Go on. You've built your empire. You've conquered the business world. But I wonder, Maxwell, do you have the courage to take on something personal?" Maxwell turned fully toward him, now curious. "What do you mean?" "A bet," Christopher said with a knowing smile. "A bet that will test your control, your patience, and your pride." Maxwell crossed his arms. "I'm listening." Christopher's eyes glinted mischievously. "You marry a woman completely outside your usual type. I'm talking someone completely different from the models and socialites you surround yourself with. For 6 months. You think you can do that?" Maxwell laughed, a rich sound that echoed in the lavish penthouse. "You must be joking." "I'm serious," Christopher insisted. "No strings attached, no ulterior motives. Just a bet. You marry her, stick with it for 6 months, and I'll donate $1 million to the charity of your choice." Maxwell thought for a moment. He was used to controlling everything around him. Women were easy to come by, playthings for a night, nothing more. The idea of taking on such a ridiculous challenge both annoyed and amused him. But $1 million for charity? The idea of winning, of proving his dominance in yet another area, appealed to his ego. "All right," Maxwell said, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "I'll do it, but I'll make it my own game. I'll choose someone who's completely unsuitable for me. Someone who won't even come close to fitting in." Christopher's grin widened. "That's the spirit." Maxwell's mind raced with possibilities, and in that moment, he felt the familiar rush of excitement. This bet would be just another game, one he would undoubtedly win. The next day, Maxwell began his search. The woman he needed wasn't just any woman. She had to be the exact opposite of everything he had ever wanted. She couldn't be a socialite, a model, or someone who cared about status. He needed someone grounded, someone who would challenge him. But more than that, he needed someone who wouldn't be impressed by his money, someone who would truly be out of his league in every way. After a few days of research, Maxwell stumbled upon a name that caught his attention: Sophia Thompson, a 36-year-old social worker, passionate about helping underprivileged communities. From her photos, he could tell she was a striking woman, but not in the typical way. Her figure was curvy and full of life, but what really drew him in was the fire in her eyes, the determination in the way she lived her life. She was exactly what he was looking for: independent, strong-willed, and utterly unimpressed by the world he inhabited. Maxwell arranged a meeting, curious to see how she would react to his proposal. He didn't expect much. After all, she probably had no interest in marrying a billionaire. But that didn't matter. This was just a game. After all, when they met, he was immediately struck by her presence. She wasn't like the women he was used to. Her beauty wasn't contrived. Her confidence wasn't fake. She was everything he was not, and that intrigued him. Sophia, on the other hand, was immediately wary. She knew who Maxwell Daniels was, of course. His name was synonymous with power and wealth in Chicago. She had heard of him, seen him on the cover of magazines, and knew about his public persona. But she wasn't interested in the man behind the mask. He didn't waste any time getting to the point. "I have a proposition for you," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "I want to offer you a marriage contract." Sophia raised an eyebrow, clearly confused. A marriage contract? I'm sorry, but I don't think I understand. Maxwell leaned forward, his tone businesslike. I'm offering you 6 months of marriage. In return, I'll provide funding for your charity. Rise up. You'll have the resources to help more families, more children, and you won't have to worry about finances. I'll even improve my public image, which will help both of us. Sophia stared at him for a long moment, processing the absurdity of the situation. You're serious, aren't you? I am, Maxwell replied, without missing a beat. Sophia couldn't help but laugh, though it was tinged with disbelief. And what's the catch? Why me? I'm nothing like the women you usually associate with. Maxwell didn't flinch. Exactly. That's why I chose you. Sophia took a deep breath. She had worked too hard for the cause she believed in to turn down a financial offer like this. And despite the odd nature of the proposition, she couldn't ignore the impact it could have on her work. Fine, she said, finally. I'll do it. But I need you to understand, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for the kids and the families I work with. Don't expect anything more than that. Maxwell smiled, satisfaction flickering in his eyes. Agreed. Little did she know, this would be the beginning of a game neither of them could have predicted. The wedding was swift, almost mechanical in its execution. Maxwell had no interest in the traditional fanfare. No elaborate ceremony or romantic vows, just a simple, no-frills event that matched the business-like nature of their arrangement. The contract was signed, and in front of a small group of witnesses, they were married. To the world, it was just another high-profile union. But beneath the surface, it was far from that. Sophia moved into Maxwell's penthouse, a modern, sleek building that towered over the city like a monument to his success. It was a world she had never dreamed of inhabiting, a world that made her feel like a visitor in a foreign land. The vast space felt cold and uninviting, filled with polished marble floors and glass walls that showcased nothing but wealth and opulence. Maxwell's world was nothing like the humble communities she worked to support. Everything here was a symbol of excess, a far cry from the struggle she saw every day in her work. Sophia immediately made it clear that while she was now technically married to Maxwell, she would not play the part of a wife. She refused to share his bed, keeping her distance both emotionally and physically. She didn't care for the lavishness of the penthouse or the high-end lifestyle Maxwell embraced. In fact, she found it suffocating. Maxwell, on the other hand, was irritated by her disinterest in everything he had to offer. She refused to attend the endless social events he invited her to, preferring to spend her time at her charity center. His attempts to integrate her into his world only seemed to push her further away. Every time he tried to impress her with the perks of his life, private jets, luxury cars, exclusive parties, Sophia remained unimpressed. She didn't care about his wealth or his status. What was more frustrating to him was how little she seemed to care about him as a person. One evening, after a particularly lavish charity gala that Maxwell had dragged her to, he tried to corner her as she prepared to leave. You can't keep avoiding this life, he said, his voice sharp. You're married to me now. You should at least try to fit in. Sophia's eyes flashed with a mixture of frustration and resolve. I'm not your accessory, Maxwell. I'm here because I need the funding for my work. That's it. I'm not here to play your games or pretend that I care about your world. Maxwell's jaw clenched. He was used to getting what he wanted, and he wasn't used to being challenged. But for some reason, the way she looked at him with such calm defiance got under his skin in a way no one else's had before. Fine, he said coldly. Do whatever you want. Just don't expect me to change. But he knew, deep down, that something was starting to change inside him. Sophia wasn't like the women he was used to. She wasn't trying to impress him or seek his approval. She was unshakable in a way he hadn't anticipated, and it both frustrated and intrigued him. For the first time, he felt like he was no longer in control. A week later, Maxwell found himself accompanying Sophia to her charity center, Rise Up, for the first time. She had insisted that he come, partly out of obligation to their agreement, and partly because she was determined to show him the reality of her world. Maxwell was less than thrilled about the visit, but he knew it was part of the deal. He had to at least pretend to care about her cause. When they arrived at the center, Maxwell immediately felt out of place. The contrast between this modest building and the grandeur of his penthouse was stark. The walls were cracked in places, the floors worn from years of use, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. It was nothing like the pristine offices and luxurious surroundings he was used to. But what struck him more than anything was the silence that hung in the air, an oppressive stillness that seemed to seep into his bones. Sophia led him through the building, showing him the various programs they ran to help struggling families. He watched as a group of volunteers helped children with their homework in a small, cramped room. In another area, single mothers gathered in a circle, sharing their experiences and seeking advice. Maxwell couldn't help but notice the exhaustion on their faces, the weight of their lives pressing down on them. It was a reality he had never truly confronted. They stopped in front of a room where several young children were eating lunch. Maxwell had never seen poverty up close like this. He had never had to witness the struggles of people who were barely scraping by. The children's clothes were worn, their faces thin from hunger. His initial instinct was to look away, but something about the sight of their malnourished faces made him pause. Sophia watched him silently, noticing the discomfort in his eyes. "This is where the real work happens, Maxwell," she said softly. "These kids, these families, they're the ones who need help, not the wealthy donors at galas, not the charities with flashy fundraisers. It's the people in this room who need it the most." Maxwell couldn't bring himself to respond. For the first time in his life, he felt an unfamiliar emotion, guilt. It wasn't just guilt about the children he saw. It was guilt about everything. His entire life had been about making money, building his empire, climbing higher and higher. But what had he really achieved? What had he done to make a difference? As they walked through the center, Sophia spoke to him about her work, her passion for helping others, and the sacrifices she made. Maxwell listened, though he found it hard to reconcile her words with the reality he had always known. He had always believed success was about hard work and determination, traits he prided himself on. But now, seeing the desperation and hopelessness in the eyes of the people around him, he couldn't deny that something about his understanding of success had been wrong. By the time they left, Maxwell was silent, lost in thought. He had always believed that money could solve every problem, that power was the key to changing the world. But as he looked at the children playing outside the center, he realized that money alone couldn't fix the things that truly mattered. Sophia didn't say anything to him as they drove back to the penthouse. But Maxwell could feel the weight of her gaze on him, as if she knew something had shifted inside him. Whether he wanted to admit it or not, something had changed, and it was a change he couldn't ignore. Maxwell had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, to dominate every aspect of his life with the precision of a well-oiled machine. But something about Sophia, something about the people at Rise Up, was beginning to chip away at the carefully constructed armor he had built around himself. For the first time, he couldn't simply bulldoze his way through challenges. His wealth and power didn't seem to matter in the world Sophia inhabited. A few days after his visit to the community center, Maxwell found himself at another gala. This one was particularly lavish, an exclusive charity event that attracted the wealthiest people in the city. He had been to hundreds of these events, mingling with high-profile individuals, making connections, and throwing money at causes that would get him recognition. But this time, he couldn't shake the image of the hungry children and the worn-out mothers from his mind. Sophia had reluctantly agreed to attend, though she made it clear she had no interest in participating in the superficiality of the event. As soon as they arrived, she immediately pulled away, refusing to engage with the glittering crowd of socialites and donors. She wasn't impressed by the extravagant displays or the extravagant speeches. Instead, she spent most of her time in quiet conversations with a few of the event organizers, discussing practical ways to make a difference. Maxwell watched from across the room as Sophia politely declined offers of champagne and mingled with a few of the guests who seemed more interested in discussing the real-world impact of the charity rather than the perks of being at an exclusive event. The disconnect between her behavior and the others around her was palpable. After a while, he walked over to her, trying to hide the irritation in his voice. "What are you doing here, Sophia? You're wasting your time with these people." She looked up at him, unamused. "I'm not wasting my time. I'm trying to actually help, not just look good while doing it. Maxwell's patience was wearing thin. You know how this works. You need to play the game if you want to get results. It's all about image, about making the right connections. Sophia's eyes hardened. And that's the problem, Maxwell. You think charity is about the image. You think it's about who's seen giving the most, about who looks the best in front of the cameras. But it's not. It's about making a real difference, even if no one's watching. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had always seen charity as a tool, a way to boost his reputation, a way to get his name on prestigious donor lists. But now, as he watched Sophia stand her ground, he realized how shallow his own efforts had been. Was that all he was really doing, using charity as a way to look good? Had he ever truly cared about making a difference? Sophia turned to walk away, but Maxwell grabbed her arm, his frustration boiling over. You can't just reject everything, Sophia. You need to learn how to play by the rules. She jerked her arm away, her voice sharp. I don't need to play by your rules. I'll never fit into this world, Maxwell, and I'm not going to pretend I want to. This isn't why I'm here. Maxwell stood there, speechless, watching her walk away. For the first time, he realized that everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was hollow in comparison to the passion and authenticity Sophia brought to everything she did. His mind swirled with confusion. Was this how real change happened? Was it even possible for someone like him, someone so ingrained in the world of money and status, to truly make a difference? The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Maxwell could hardly focus on anything. Sophia's words lingered in his mind like a weight he couldn't shake off. For the first time, he was forced to confront the fact that he might be part of the problem, not the solution. Maxwell's mind was in turmoil. He had never been one to question his actions, his motives, or the very system that had brought him his wealth and success. But over the past few weeks, he had started to see things differently. It wasn't just the community center or the charity galas that had shaken him. It was something deeper, something he couldn't ignore any longer. He found himself visiting Rise Up more frequently, though he couldn't quite explain why. At first, it had been a sense of obligation, a way to fulfill the terms of his bet and keep up appearances. But now, he felt something he hadn't expected, genuine curiosity. Every time he stepped into the center, he felt as though the walls he had built around himself were slowly crumbling. One day, as he was walking through the center, he met a young mother named Rachel. She had a newborn child in her arms and a look of desperation in her eyes. She told Maxwell her story, how she had been living on the streets after fleeing an abusive relationship, how she had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The helplessness in her voice struck Maxwell to his core. He watched as Sophia calmly spoke to Rachel, offering her a bed in the center and helping her fill out paperwork for government assistance. There was no fanfare, no grand gestures, just quiet, determined action. Maxwell had seen plenty of people in his life who claimed to care about the less fortunate, but they had always done so from a distance, with grand speeches and photo ops. But with Sophia, it was different. She didn't need recognition, didn't need praise. She just acted. As Rachel left with her baby in tow, Maxwell was left standing there, overwhelmed by the raw emotion of the moment. He had seen this before, people in need, people struggling, but it had always been someone else's problem, something he could ignore from his comfortable distance. But now, it felt personal. Why are you doing this? Maxwell asked, his voice soft, almost questioning. Sophia turned to him, her expression unreadable. Because these people need help, and I can't stand by and do nothing. No one else is going to help them, Maxwell. They don't have the luxury of waiting for someone to come along and do it for them. If not me, then who? Maxwell swallowed hard, something shifting inside him. He had never seen the world through her eyes before, never understood the weight of the struggle she witnessed every day. It was easy for him to look at the world from the top down, to dismiss the poor as just a statistic, another problem to be solved with money. But now he was seeing the faces of real people, people who weren't just struggling for survival, but were clinging to hope in a world that had forgotten them. In that moment, Maxwell made a silent promise to himself. He didn't know what it would take to change, to make a real difference, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep living in the same way. Something had to change. Maxwell's transformation, though gradual, was undeniable. At first, it had been a reluctant duty, a way to salvage his reputation and keep up with the terms of the bet, but over time, his commitment to the community center became more than just a strategic move. He began to spend more time at Rise Up, not as a billionaire with a hidden agenda, but as someone who genuinely cared about the cause. Sophia watched him with a mixture of skepticism and hope. She had seen countless people come and go, well-meaning philanthropists who promised change but quickly retreated when the reality of helping the disadvantaged became too difficult. Maxwell had started to show signs of real change, but she was cautious. She couldn't let herself believe that he was any different from the rest, especially after the way he had manipulated her into this marriage in the first place. Maxwell wasn't deterred. He used his influence and wealth in ways he had never considered before. He personally reached out to other successful business people, convincing them to donate large sums to the community center, not for recognition or publicity, but because he knew it would make a tangible difference in the lives of those who depended on it. He ensured that the funds went directly to the families in need, to programs that would provide sustainable support instead of temporary handouts. The more he immersed himself in the work, the more he realized how much he had taken his privilege for granted. He had never truly understood what it meant to struggle, to fight for every inch of progress. But now, seeing the resilience and determination of people like Sophia, he couldn't ignore the vast differences between his life and theirs. One day, after a particularly difficult meeting at the center, Maxwell asked Sophia if he could walk her home. She hesitated for a moment before agreeing, and they walked together through the quiet streets of the city, past homeless shelters and rundown apartments, into neighborhoods that Maxwell had never even noticed before. As they walked, he spoke about the work he had been doing, about the people he had met, and how it had changed his perspective. But it wasn't just about the work anymore. He was beginning to understand the value of the people he was helping, their strength, their ability to persevere in the face of insurmountable odds. Sophia listened silently, and when they reached her apartment, she turned to face him. There was a softness in her expression now, though the caution still lingered in her eyes. I see what you're trying to do, Maxwell, and I can't tell you how much it means to me that you're really here. But it's not enough to throw money at a problem. You need to understand the people you're trying to help. You need to understand what they go through every day. Maxwell nodded, a heavy weight settling in his chest. I know. I'm trying. I can't change everything overnight, but I'm learning. I want to help, and I want to do it right. Sophia's gaze softened, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand. But the journey was far from over. She wasn't going to forgive him just because he was making an effort. She couldn't erase the betrayal of the past, and she couldn't forget the way he had treated her when everything had begun. But seeing the sincerity in his eyes, she couldn't ignore the fact that Maxwell was changing. Maxwell's life was no longer just about the next big deal or the fastest way to climb higher on the social ladder. His relationship with Sophia had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. They spent more time together, discussing everything from social justice to their personal struggles, and as much as she tried to keep him at arm's length, she began to see a side of him she never thought possible. He was no longer just the arrogant, entitled billionaire. He was someone who was struggling to find his place in a world that had always been a game to him. But despite the growing connection between them, there was still a barrier between them, an invisible wall that kept her from fully trusting him. Every time they spoke about the future, about what might happen next, that wall seemed to get higher. Sophia knew she couldn't allow herself to fall for him again. Not when so much of what had happened between them had been built on lies, manipulation, and the cruelty of his bet. Maxwell could sense her distance, and it troubled him more than he cared to admit. He had grown accustomed to getting what he wanted, to making everything fall into place according to his design. But with Sophia, nothing was that simple. She had built her life around her values, and no amount of wealth or charm could change that. One evening, after another long day at the center, Maxwell invited Sophia to dinner at a small restaurant, a place far removed from the glittering luxury he usually inhabited. It was quiet, intimate, and simple, a stark contrast to the lavish banquets he was used to. As they sat across from each other, he could feel the tension in the air, an unspoken question hanging between them. Sophia had been quiet for most of the meal, pushing her food around on her plate. Maxwell watched her closely, wondering how to bridge the gap that seemed to have widened since their last conversation. Finally, he could take the silence no longer. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low. Sophia looked up, her brow furrowing. "What's that?" Maxwell hesitated, the words coming with difficulty. "I was wrong. All of it. The bet, the way I treated you, everything. I thought I could manipulate the situation, that I could control everything like I always had, but I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about myself. I've spent my whole life believing that money could solve everything, that power could get me anything I wanted. But I've never been truly happy. Not the way you are, not the way the people at Rise Up are. I've been chasing something that doesn't matter." Sophia's eyes softened, though she was still guarded. "Maxwell, you can't just apologize and expect everything to go back to the way it was. You can't just fix things by throwing money at them or by changing your actions for a few weeks." "I know," he admitted, "but I need you to know that I'm trying. I'm not the man I was before, and I know that's hard to believe. But I want to be better. For you, for myself, for everyone I've wronged." Sophia paused, her gaze fixed on him, her heart torn between the pain of the past and the hope of something different. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that the man sitting across from her was truly changing. But the truth was, she wasn't sure yet. "You're right," she said quietly. "You can't just fix everything with words. But maybe you can show me. Show me you're really changing." Maxwell nodded, his heart swelling with the faintest glimmer of hope. "I will. I'll prove it to you, one step at a time." The air in the penthouse felt heavy, as though the weight of everything that had transpired was pressing down on Maxwell's chest. He thought he had come so far. He had worked tirelessly to prove that he was more than the arrogant, self-absorbed man he once was. Yet, in the quiet of the night, something loomed over him, something that threatened to shatter the fragile bridge he had built between himself and Sophia. He hadn't expected Julian Whitmore's reappearance. It had been weeks since the last time Maxwell had seen his old friend, the one who had concocted the absurd bet in the first place. Julian, with his smooth smile and calculated charm, had returned uninvited, and that would be the catalyst that unraveled everything. It was a typical evening when Julian appeared at Maxwell's penthouse, strolling through the door like he had never been away. Maxwell had been sitting in the study, looking over Rise Up's latest funding reports, when Julian's voice had cut through the silence. "Maxwell, my old friend, how's the wife?" Julian asked, leaning casually against the doorway, his gaze flicking to the woman who had come to mean so much more to Maxwell than just a pawn in a game. Sophia had been sitting on the couch, reading over some documents for the center. She looked up, instantly sensing the change in the air. Julian's presence was like a poison, an unwelcome reminder of a past that Maxwell had worked so hard to move beyond. "Julian," Maxwell said, his voice cool but controlled. He didn't want to let on how much the man's visit disturbed him. He had no idea what Julian was up to, but he had a sinking feeling that it wasn't good. Julian walked further into the room, a smirk on his lips. "It's been a while, hasn't it? I've been keeping up with the news. I see you've really thrown yourself into this charity thing. Quite the change, Maxwell. Almost like you're trying to atone for your past sins." Sophia's eyes narrowed. "What is this about?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with suspicion. Maxwell stood up from his chair, his mind racing. He knew Julian's return couldn't be coincidental. The man had a knack for stirring up trouble, and Maxwell was certain he was about to do just that. "I think I should be the one to explain," Julian said smoothly, taking a step toward them. "You see, Sophia, all of this marriage, this charity work, the new you, it's all part of a bet Maxwell made with me. A bet to see if he could make a woman like you fall for him. I challenged him to marry someone completely outside his usual type, to see if he could stick with it for 6 months." Sophia's face drained of color as the words settled in. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. It was like the ground beneath her had been ripped away. She looked at Maxwell, her eyes wide with disbelief, but he could only stare back, helpless. He had known this moment would come, but the reality of it was worse than he had imagined. "You're lying," she whispered. but her voice trembled with the pain of the truth she was unwilling to accept. Maxwell's heart pounded as he tried to find the words to explain, to apologize, to make it right. But there was nothing he could say that would undo the damage. It was supposed to be a game, Maxwell admitted quietly, the weight of the confession sinking in. I never expected it to turn into this. I never thought I'd feel the way I do about you, Sophia. But I do. And I never should have made that bet in the first place. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Sophia stood up abruptly, backing away from him as if she were afraid he might reach out and pull her back into the lie. You used me. You lied to me from the start. Everything about this, everything I believed, was a game to you. Maxwell's chest tightened. It wasn't just a game anymore, Sophia. It hasn't been for a long time. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her expression was one of anger and betrayal. How could you do this to me, Maxwell? How could you play with my life like that? I never meant to hurt you, he said, his voice raw. But I did, and I'm sorry. Please believe me when I say that everything has changed. I'm not that man anymore. Sophia turned away, shaking her head. I don't know if I can believe that. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. Maxwell reached for her, but she stepped back, her eyes filled with pain. I need to go, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Without waiting for a response, she turned and left the penthouse, leaving Maxwell standing there, broken and lost. He had known this day would come, but nothing could have prepared him for the feeling of watching the woman he loved walk away, the distance between them growing wider with every step. Maxwell sat alone in the penthouse long after Sophia had gone, the silence pressing in around him. He could still feel the weight of her presence, the soft echo of her laughter that had once filled the space. Now, everything was empty, just the sound of his own regrets and the faint memory of what could have been. It wasn't the first time he'd felt like a failure. For most of his life, Maxwell had been defined by success, by his ability to control every aspect of his existence. But nothing had prepared him for the depth of loss he felt now. He had built walls around his heart for years, hiding behind the shield of power and wealth, never allowing himself to be vulnerable. But with Sophia, he had let his guard down, and in doing so, he had destroyed everything that mattered. Maxwell's mind kept returning to the same thought. How could I fix this? He couldn't undo the past. He couldn't take back the lies he had told her. But he could show her, somehow, that he had changed. He could prove that the man she had seen him become wasn't just some temporary shift in behavior, some fleeting phase. He was different now. The work at Rise Up had opened his eyes to the world in a way that nothing else had. He couldn't go back to being the person he was before. Maxwell took out his phone and scrolled through the contacts, stopping at Sophia's name. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the screen, but then he put the phone down. No message he could send would fix what had been broken. He needed to do more than apologize. He needed to show her that he was serious, that his commitment to change wasn't just about winning her back. It was about making things right for everyone he had ever wronged. The next day, Maxwell made a decision. He would double the funding for Rise Up. He would ensure that the programs for single mothers, for children, and for struggling families would be sustained for years to come. But more than that, he would be there, not as a businessman looking for a return on his investment, but as someone who truly cared about the people who depended on it. He would prove to Sophia that he was worthy of her trust, worthy of her love, not with grand gestures or promises, but with actions that spoke louder than words. And he would do it, not for her forgiveness, but because it was the right thing to do. As Maxwell moved forward with his plans, the uncertainty about his future remained. But one thing was clear. He was no longer the man he once was. He would spend the rest of his life showing that change wasn't just a momentary shift. It was a lifelong commitment. And perhaps, just perhaps, that would be enough to win back the woman he had lost. Weeks passed since Maxwell's confession, but the wound between him and Sophia was still fresh, like an open scar he couldn't quite heal. The distance between them had grown more pronounced with each passing day. She had moved into her own apartment, focusing on her charity work, determined not to let the heartbreak interfere with her mission. But every step she took without him, every new decision she made, only reminded her of the trust she had lost. And yet, Despite everything, she couldn't ignore the subtle shifts she had noticed in Maxwell's behavior. There was something undeniably different about him now. Sophia had heard through mutual acquaintances how Maxwell had doubled Rise Up's funding. At first, she had dismissed it as a last-ditch attempt to win her back, a grand gesture to mend the relationship. But over time, she began to hear reports of his genuine involvement, spending long hours at the center, speaking to the families who needed help, investing his own time and resources to better the lives of the people he once ignored. It wasn't just about public image anymore. He was giving without expecting anything in return. One afternoon, while going through some new proposals for the center, she found herself thinking about Maxwell, not with the bitterness that had marked their last conversation, but with a sense of reluctant curiosity. Has he really changed? She wondered. Is this who he is now, or is it just another act? It was a struggle for her, torn between the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. She had seen his self-centeredness, his ruthlessness, the way he manipulated everything for his own gain. But she had also seen the cracks in his armor, the vulnerability in his eyes, and the compassion that had begun to take root deep inside him. Sophia didn't know if she was ready to forgive him. Not yet. She had learned to guard her heart, to protect herself from more pain. But she couldn't deny that she was starting to see him in a different light, as someone who was capable of growth, of redemption. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Maxwell called her. His voice was different, softer, more earnest than she remembered. Sophia, I know you're still angry with me, and I don't blame you. But I need to tell you something, he began. His words hanging in the air between them. She remained silent on the other end of the line, unsure of how to respond. He paused, as though he was choosing his next words carefully. I turned down a business deal today, he said. It was worth millions, but it would have hurt the people I'm trying to help through Rise Up. I couldn't do it. I realized that I can't go back to being the person I was before. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, but I want you to know that everything I'm doing, it's for real. Sophia's heart skipped a beat, a mixture of disbelief and a flicker of hope stirring inside her. Could it be true? Was he finally understanding what really mattered? The tension in her chest loosened slightly, but she held on to the wariness that had kept her protected for so long. You're serious about this, aren't you? She asked softly, unable to hide the mix of skepticism and curiosity in her voice. I am, he said without hesitation. I'm not perfect. I never will be, but I'm trying. And I don't want to be the man I was. Not anymore. Sophia was silent for a long moment, her thoughts racing. She had to make a choice, to stay distant, to hold on to her pride and anger, or to allow herself to believe in the possibility of something different. Finally, she spoke. I'm not saying I forgive you, Maxwell. I'm not ready for that yet, but I'm willing to see if this is real. Maxwell's voice softened, a quiet relief flooding through it. I understand. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know. And with that, the conversation ended, leaving both of them in a limbo of unspoken emotions, uncertain but cautiously hopeful. The following weeks were a delicate dance between the two of them. Maxwell continued his work with Rise Up, pouring himself into it as though it were the only thing that mattered. He attended meetings, spoke with community leaders, and made sure the families the charity served knew that he was committed to their cause, not just in theory but in action. He didn't expect Sophia to fall back into his arms. He didn't even expect her to forgive him. But his actions were proof of the sincerity that words could no longer convey. For Sophia, it was a slow process. Her feelings for Maxwell had never been simple, and now, after everything that had happened, she struggled to understand where her heart stood. She watched him from a distance, observing his transformation, and wondered if it was enough. It wasn't just about his past mistakes. It was about whether the man he was becoming could truly stand up to the person he had been before. Could he be the man she had always believed he could be? Their paths crossed more frequently as Sophia became more involved in the center, working alongside Maxwell and watching him interact with the people they were trying to help. It was in these moments, when he wasn't thinking about public image, when he wasn't trying to impress her, that she saw the man he had grown into. There was a humility about him now, a genuine desire to make a difference. One evening, after a long day at the center, They found themselves alone in the quiet of Maxwell's office. The weight of everything that had passed between them lingered in the air, but there was also a sense of tentative peace. Sophia, Maxwell began, his voice low, as if searching for the right words. I don't want to make this about me. It's about what we're doing here. But I have to say this. I've spent my whole life chasing power, money, and control. But it's never felt like this, like I'm actually doing something that matters. And that's because of you. Sophia looked at him, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of emotions, appreciation, uncertainty, and a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. You've changed, she said quietly, almost to herself. But it's not just about you anymore, Maxwell. It's about us, what we can build together, the difference we can make, not just for the world, but for each other. Maxwell took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. I'm not asking you to forget the past, Sophia. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, just your trust. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of it. Her breath caught in her throat as she processed his words. For the first time in so long, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something more. The pain, the loss, the betrayal. It was all still there, but it didn't define them anymore. Sophia looked into his eyes, her gaze steady. Then prove it. Maxwell smiled softly, his heart swelling with the realization that this was the beginning of something new, something real. And with that, they stepped forward together, knowing that the journey ahead would be long, filled with its own set of challenges and uncertainties. But for the first time, they were ready to face it, not as a bet, not as a game, but as two people who had found love and redemption, not despite their flaws, but because of them. The ending, though open, was filled with the quiet hope that redemption could lead to something far greater than they had ever expected. Together, they would rewrite their story, one that was built not on broken promises, but on a love that had finally found its true foundation. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to and follow along with this story. I hope it brought you enjoyable and heartfelt moments. If you like this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe.